Welcome to Panel 1, The Road to Being First. Please welcome to the stage our moderator, Ms. Dahlia Lithwick, and our distinguished panelists, Mr. Edwin Meese III, Mr. Jay O'Connor, and Mr. Evan Thomas.
How delighted we are to welcome this extraordinary first panel. And I just want to say, I'm Dahlia Lithwick. I cover reports in the law for Slate.com, and I started covering the court in 1999, so I had the joy and privilege of covering Sandra O'Connor's time on the court. Seated to my far left is Evan Thomas. He is the author of 10 books, including a magisterial biography of Sandra O'Connor called First, Sandra O'Connor. To his immediate right, Jay O'Connor. He's the managing principal, Solitary Associates, and on the governing board of iCivics, which is the civics project that Justice O'Connor, transformational civics project that she has brought to children in this country. And to my immediate left, needing no introduction, General Edwin Meese III. He's the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation, and he served as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from 1985 to 1988. So please join me in welcoming this extraordinary panel. And this first panel really does have the absolute joy of setting the table for the rest of the day and giving a sense of what it was like through the early arc of Justice O'Connor's, then before Justice O'Connor's career, what brought her to the attention of President Reagan and then the world. And so we're going to try to break it down for you in the coming hour. And we're going to start by talking a little bit about her biography, her astounding biography in Arizona, her time in the Arizona State Legislature, and then we'll close with the conversation about her confirmation. I just want to say as a point of personal privilege, and again, because it is the theme of this particular panel, that I started Stanford Law School in the fall of 1992, and I can say without a doubt I would not have gone to law school but for knowing that Sandra Day O'Connor had gone before me. And I say that not because my legal career is terribly interesting or important. I say it because I really wonder often if Justice O'Connor knows how many tens and thousands of young women took steps that they would not have otherwise done but for her leadership and modeling. And so it is really a particular joy and honor to be in this conversation today. So I want to start at the Lazy Bee, at the ranch where it all started, and Justice O'Connor so often says that she is such a creature of that upbringing at the Lazy Bee Ranch. So I wonder, Evan, as the biography, if you could set the table for us a little bit. Give us a sense of how that upbringing, I think we've all heard some of the stories, but that upbringing at the Lazy Bee inflects on the person that Sandra Day O'Connor becomes.
The Lazy Bee is enormous. When she was a little girl, 160,000 acres. Took a man on a horseback a whole day to ride across it. It was a world unto itself. Very beautiful, austere, beautiful. 2,000 cows. And the Day family, Mr. Day, Sandra Day O'Connor said, we called it our own country. And the king of this country was Mr. Day, who was a magnificent man, a great, now more than a cowboy, he was a manager of cowboys, but a guy who could fix anything, handle anything, deal with anything. And he taught self-reliance to his daughter and to anybody who was around him. And the story that she liked to tell, that Sandra liked to tell, was that when Sandra Day was 15 years old, one of her jobs was to take lunch to the Roundup, which is way across the prairie. So she got up at 5 a.m. and she cooked the roast and she cooked the cake and she loaded up the truck. And as she headed out there on the rough road, she had a flat tire. And she's a slight girl, and she had to jump on the jack to change the tire. It took an hour. She got there, and her father looked at her and said, "You're late." And she said, "Well, Dad, I had a flat tire." And he said, "Next time, leave earlier." That was the story she told her clerks. The message was pretty clear. No excuses. Get it done. And so obviously Mr. Day had a huge influence on her, and he was a loving, powerful father. Mr. Day was also could be an intimidating guy. And Sandra's mother, I think, was just as important, maybe even more important, because Mrs. Day was a elegant woman. Out in this dusty ranch, wore dresses, subscribed to Vogue, wore hose and nice shoes. And Mr. Day could be a little tough on her in the evening. He could be a little bit of a bully. And the way she dealt with him was not by being submissive and not by rolling over, but also not by getting into stupid fights. And she had a way of kind of a graceful way of finessing things, of walking away from stupid fights, of knowing when to engage and when not to. And Sandra watched her mother and father, and I think that was an incredibly valuable lesson for her on how to deal with difficult situations, frankly, when people don't always get along. But when not to take the bait. That was a big thing for her.
I wonder, Jay, if you want to amplify a little bit the ways in which she was just entirely a product of that biographical setting, that she really was, in some sense, quintessentially, I mean, she really, I think, throughout, played so deeply to this persona she had of just being utterly independent, someone for whom I think, as Evan just said so eloquently, was very feminine, but also extremely tough and not apt to be intimidated by anyone. Had she been born in Connecticut, would she have been a completely different person?
I think she would have been. And she herself saw the lazy bee as foundational to who she was. I mean, she loved the lazy bee. And when she ended up as a schoolgirl, the closest little town was about 30 miles away, and it wasn't a great school. And so her parents decided, okay, we've got to send her away to school. And she went to school in El Paso, Texas, with her grandmother and aunt, and she stayed with them, and she went to school with her cousin. And she missed the ranch terribly and always loved spending time there. It was foundational to who she thought of herself as. And at the ranch, help is 30 miles away, and even in the town, they probably don't have the parts you need. And so when problems are going to happen on a ranch, things break, problems happen. And so I think what she learned, as Evan alluded to and described already, is that when problems happen, you have to deal with them in a very pragmatic way. You can't rely on some other expert to come and save the day, because that may be way too long. You can't wait weeks for some expert to come in. And so you had to resolve with just the people that you had at the ranch. You had to fix things yourselves. And if you're out on alone, then you had to fix things by yourself. And so I think that was foundational to her persona, and she had a real sense of that. And I think the other part, I mean, she grew up in the Depression years, and times were a little thin, and you never throw anything away, and you appreciate everything that you have. So she was definitely a product of her generation, a product of her environment.
Evan, I wonder if you can take us fairly quickly just through the educational piece of this, because that, again, I think just the notion that she was going to law school is at some level, we've so internalized it, but it was incredibly improbable.
Well, she went to Stanford in 1946 with a lot of veterans, happy guys in bomber jackets who are glad to be alive. And she loved Stanford. She said in a letter home to her mom and dad, it's utopia, because they had this wonderful course there called Western Civilization. And I read her final exam when she was a 17-year-old freshman, and it's a brilliant exegesis on Madison and Jefferson, and you can see her appreciation of the rule of law as a 17-year-old girl. Talk about foundations. She got that. She was very independent-minded. At Stanford, you could go to law school after 3 years in those days, go to the law school if you had a B+ average, which she did. She had great grades. She was very self-reliant. The story I always remember was that there's a parking lot there, and she went out, and her dad gave her a car, Chrysler. And she went out and painted a parking space for herself, reserved parking space. She went to the law school. She was one of 5 women in her class of 150. Law review, Order of the Coif. She applied to 40 law firms in Los Angeles and San Francisco. She got 1 interview with Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. And they asked her, how well do you type? And she said, so-so. Now, the thing that's interesting about that story, she loved to tell that story, of course, she was never bitter about it. She said, didn't make it in the private sector, so she went to the local DA and said, I'd like to work for you. And he said, I don't have any money to hire you. And she said, I'll do it for free. And he said, I don't have any place for you. She said, I'll work off your secretary's desk. And she did. And she mastered that. She had a brief sojourn in the private sector as hanging her shingle in Phoenix. That's years later. But, you know, she can't make it in the private sector. The public sector worked out pretty well for her.
I now have to turn this over to General Meese because he told me something that cracked me up about what would have happened had Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher given her a job.
Well, if they had given her the job that she deserved as a lawyer, she probably would now be a retired lawyer from Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, living out her retirement, and never would have achieved the remarkable position that she did in the Supreme Court.
That was a bracing reminder to me of why that story works out in the end, because I generally told it in a much more grumpy fashion until you corrected me. But I'm going to ask Evan to do one more thing, which is you're going to have to talk about the relationship between Sandra Day O'Connor and Chief Justice William H. Rehnquist, because that was an intriguing part of your research.
My wife, Osi, and I had access through the O'Connor family to the justices' papers and letters. And we were looking for love letters because John O'Connor and Sandra O'Connor had a great marriage, a true, lifelong, loving romance. And we were going through the papers, and there aren't any love letters. But we went over to her chambers at the Supreme Court, and her secretary took us down to a storage closet, and there was a box marked correspondent, and I asked Jay, can we look in there? And he said, okay. And there were love letters between John and Sandra, wonderful love letters, which are in the book. But there were also 14 love letters from William Rehnquist to Sandra Day. William Rehnquist and Sandra Day were classmates. He was probably number 1 in the class. They didn't keep class rank, but he was sort of, they acknowledged. They went out first year. The story always was, the story they told always was, well, we went to the movies a few times. It was actually a little bit more than that.
Double features.
Double features. In Bill Rehnquist's 3rd year, he got a job as a Supreme Court clerk with Justice Stevens and Justice Jackson, and he was lonely, and he started writing Sandra and remembering their romance. And along about letter 7, he said, "Sandy, will you marry me?" When I pulled that letter out of the box, I gave a little yelp because they hadn't told anybody. They hadn't told their own families. I love this, Justice Blackmun, when he was sat next to Justice Rehnquist, when Sandra came on the court, Justice Blackmun turned to Justice Rehnquist and said, "Now, no fooling around." But basically nobody knew. And the sweet thing about this is they ended up having a great friendship. Yes, Sandra turned him down. She actually strung him along for a little while. But she did turn him down, but she did it in a gentle way. They formed a real friendship. They both married the loves of their lives. And they had a great, quiet, but real friendship at the court that worked out very well in later years. And we can get to this later, Justice Rehnquist quietly lobbied the Reagan administration, or at least the Attorney General, to put her on the court.
I feel that I need to give Jay an opportunity to respond if he wants to respond. How was it to find out that that your mom had a love letter from Chief Justice
Well, it
Reagan?
was a surprise. And so I'm sure my dad knew more about the relationship. That isn't something that she would have hidden from my dad. But she never disclosed it to her 3 sons. And so Evan called up and said, boy, I found some interesting letters. Listen to this. And so we were definitely surprised. She had handled that very quietly.
And Jay, I think I want to stay with you.
But I wanted just to say the thing that was interesting to us is what we had seen with Chief Justice, with her relationship with the Rehnquist family and with the Chief Justice Rehnquist is they were devoted friends for such a long time. And throughout even before their tenure on the court, after what Evan talked about happened, his family traveled with my mom's family on some trips. And so they had the basis for a long-standing friendship that endured throughout their time in the court and later on. And they spent a lot of time together with one another's families in D.C. and socialized together. And so it was a really wonderful, initially interesting relationship that turned into a wonderful professional relationship and a warm, close friendship over the years.
And I know that this is not the panel where we're going to talk about doctrine, but I think this could be the panel where we talk about work ethic. And just as we turn to her time in the Arizona legislature, I wonder, Jay, if you could just talk to the extent that you have recollections of what it was like to be raised by someone who, by every account, was a juggernaut, was just nonstop, Energizer Bunny, go, go, go. I remember the first stories I heard about her was having kids in strollers, running around doing legal work and doing political work. That's all true, right?
Absolutely. I mean, she is a force of nature. There's just no doubt. And so she was in Arizona. She worked in all 3 branches of government. And she was she was clearly the best known woman in the state of Arizona in the government. And started off in the working in the Attorney General's office, became majority leader of the Arizona State Senate, was the first woman in the country to hold that position, and then went on and became a state court judge. And so, but we knew her as mom. And the famous line is she would have these long work sessions at the state Senate, and one of her colleagues, who was one of the leaders, said, with Sandra Day O'Connor, there is no Miller time. And what it meant is that she would go from long hours and do one thing to she was constantly in motion, constantly doing things. And so she would come home from a very demanding job, and she ran the family. And so she was responsible for overseeing the household and making, getting our dinners done and organizing our camps and organizing all of our activities. And her way, when she got home, she didn't sort of sit down and just plop down on the couch and hang out. I mean, she would sort of go home and be productive. And her way of relaxing was by going and playing on the weekend 2 sets of tennis or 3 sets of tennis and then a round of 18 holes of golf on the same day. So we were exhausted. We never got a rest until she went off to Washington. Thank God.
I'm utterly exhausted just by hearing that account. But I wonder, Evan, would you amplify a little bit? And then I'm going to ask General Meese the same question. But that time on the Arizona legislature was absolutely formative. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit both about sort of how she got herself there, but also help us understand what that did to help vault her into what would become the next thing.
There are a couple stories about her in the legislature that are revealing. One is that she had to deal with, this is the Arizona legislature in 1970. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of men misbehaving, and she had to deal with that. She was the majority leader, first woman ever to be the majority leader of a state senate. And to get the budget passed, she had to deal with the House Appropriations Committee chairman, whose name was Tom Goodwin. Tom Goodwin was a drunk by 10 a.m. drunk. And he was just impossible to deal with. And she finally called him on his drinking. And he looked at her and he said, "If you were a man, I'd punch you in the nose." And she said, "If you were a man, you could." Now, I like to tell that story, but the significant thing, actually, it's a one-off. She didn't go around having confrontations, putting down men. That's a funny story, but that's pretty singular. Far more often, she just learned not to be baited by them, not to take the bait, not to get into stupid fights, to get to the point. She was very efficient. She had a thick skin, and she was very politically shrewd. And this is the second story, which I think is very revealing. The Equal Rights Amendment in 1972 was for a while almost non-controversial. It was in the Republican platform and the Democratic platform in 1968. But by the mid-'70s or early mid-'70s, it had become controversial. It was making its way through the states. It had been ratified in many states. But Phyllis Schlafly, who you may remember, was running a campaign against it, a very effective campaign. And so it comes to Arizona. Majority Leader O'Connor introduces the ERA to the Arizona legislature, introduces it, and then lets it die in committee. Now, the activists were furious at her. They betrayed her. What the hell are you doing, letting it die in committee? You're the majority leader. And she just kept quiet about it. Well, what was really going on here? She realized that it couldn't pass. It was not going to pass the Arizona legislature. So why break your pick? Why make a big, emotional, moralistic, virtue-signaling show when something's not going to pass? Instead, as she used her power as majority leader to amend every single law in the state of Arizona that discriminated against women, and there were many of them, about owning credit cards, about owning property. I mean, Arizona law in 1970, 8-hour work week, was very discriminatory to women. She had a list. We found it in her paper. She had a list. She made it in her hand, a list of all the laws, one by one. She did it in some in short measure, some in full measure, but she did what she could. She achieved what she could in the state and let the other thing pass on.
I love that story because I think it's such a quintessentially pragmatic thing to do. And I think that for me, that was such a stunning revelation about you don't always know what you don't know. I wonder, General Meese, if you could answer kind of a version of the same question. When we spoke on the phone to prepare for this, you noted and I noted she was the last person to have served in a legislature. We have not had anyone subsequently who brings that skill set to the court. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, I know you got to know her after, but can you talk a little bit about some of the skills she took away from that time and the ways in which it became applicable in her later life? In other words, I think I want you to explain why it's important to have former legislators on the Supreme Court.
Well, I think there's two things. One, of course, was her personal relationships. We learned those being in a governmental body of people who all have very strong egos. I think that's the most charitable way of putting it. And there's a way of getting along with those people and making progress and getting things done. And she certainly, I think, probably had that from an early stage, from what I've heard even today. But she certainly, in her legislative work, where it was able to work well with people, she had that sense of priorities that Evan just mentioned. She understood what was important and what wasn't important. And so those qualities also, I think, served her very well when she got later on the appellate court in Arizona and ultimately on the Supreme Court. So I think that experience was a part of her formative years that made her such an important person and such an effective person. There's one other thing that's kind of interesting, because Evan mentioned she had a short time in private practice. And I didn't find out until much later that the person that she had the private practice partnership with, a man by the name of Tom Tobin, was the brother of one of my law partners in quite a ways away in San Diego when I was practicing law, I guess about the same time. But I never had, obviously, the chance to ever meet her then, but it was interesting. But I think that, I think probably you can say that it's been implied by both of the speakers, and that is that she learned a lot from every experience that she had and utilized those qualities when she came and culminated in a very effective jurist then on the Supreme Court.
So I want to get to the confirmation process, but I think I want to loop back to Jay, because I think one of the things that I'm pulling out, I pulled it out of Evan's book and then in this conversation, is that it is sometimes hard to reconcile these two people we're hearing about. One who sort of spoke the truth. She was not one to hide her thoughts. She, time and time again, certainly by the time she came on the court, she was pretty plain, including with oral advocates, who she just called it like she saw it. And yet we're hearing about somebody who is very, very sort of canny and savvy and political. So I'm a little bit having trouble squaring the truth teller O'Connor with the one who is just a very, very deft reader of people and knew how not to get in fights. And I think I also want to have you take a run at squaring the other thing that is, I think Evan flicked at it, which is she's a deeply feminine woman. And she came across at her confirmation hearing. She was not in any way trying to be a man in a man's world, but yet she was incredibly effective in a man's world. And that was an enormous compound question, so you can choose to ignore parts 1 or 2, but can you at least flesh out some of those contradictions that are emerging?
So on your latter question on sort of her approach as a woman, when at the time she was, before being nominated to the court and the time she was nominated to the court, there were not as many example figures and sort of women leaders in politics, and obviously not in the judiciary, there were none of those, but it was really sort of a different time, and it was a real transition, I think, for the country, where women had played very traditional roles, and you fast forward today, and there's a very different view towards women's issues and so forth. Evan framed her in his book as a real bridge from the traditional role of a woman and approach for a woman to sort of the modern era, and I think that was an apt description. She was very effective in her professional relationships and social relationships in dealing with difficult issues, but doing it in her own way. And she certainly was not she did not consider herself a feminist. Was not strident outspoken on women's issues, but she felt very strongly on the importance of more equal representation and rights for women. And her approach was very much to overcome obstacles and lead by example. So her approach was not to complain about things. Her approach was to try to take pragmatic action with respect to her own career and respect to the own things that she was dealing with. So I think that was her real approach there.
Do you have?
One thought. Yes, she could be very direct. She was scary to journalists, I know. When I was a journalist, I was scared of her. But yeah, she had in fact, she had these eyes. She has these brilliant eyes she sort of weaponized. And I ran into a Kennedy clerk the other day who was the author of a famous, he went to one of her clerks and said, "She has beams of fire." She could just bore a hole through you. But she had great political skills. And one thing that I noticed her clerks mentioned and her friends mentioned, she was not a gossip. Now in Washington, it's not easy to be powerful or to be part of the Washington swirl. And she loved the social life. She was out there all the time. It is difficult to do that. It's difficult even to be a Supreme Court justice with your clerks and not to gossip. And she just didn't. She could have blunt opinions, but she did not gossip. That made her much more effective. And it took a kind of self-discipline that she had. And when she caught her clerks gossiping, they heard it. We're going to have clerks here later. They can speak to this, but she didn't like it. If they were bad-mouthing the justices from other chambers and spreading wicked little stories about Justice so-and-so, she didn't want to hear about it. And I think that gave her a kind of a power. That self-discipline gave her a kind of power.
And even at home, she made a practice of not trashing colleagues, not trashing other people with whom she interacted. And I mean, she would let us know what was going on and sort of how she felt about things, but she was very, I think, fair and generous to other people and was not highly
This reminds me, Scott told me, her oldest son Scott said there were 3 rules in the household. Be home by 6, don't speak ill of others, and don't hit your brother.
He had a little more challenge with the last one. So, yeah.
So this brings us to General Meese. You're going to have to tell us how this person that we've just painted comes into the national limelight. So we know that President Reagan makes a campaign promise. He's going to tap a woman. Can you help us understand what is going on behind the scenes at the White House? How is this woman, who's still maybe not the most prominent woman on a court, how she becomes the Sandra Day O'Connor that we all know?
Well, it started because of what has been mentioned here, and this time, by this time, of course, the Korean War is over. We're in a time of relative peace. There was a lot of progress economically, and things were going forward. There were economic problems in the country and so on, but this was a time when women were actually starting to achieve things which had not really happened yet in the legal profession. As was mentioned earlier here, there was in her class, I think it said there were five women, and in my class, my class was 58. It was about, I think there were 6 at the most. Interestingly, we started with 150 men and 6 women, and we graduated 80 men and 2 women. So not too many people made it through at all, but it was very difficult for women. But women were starting to achieve positions in business, in some of the other professions, and starting to, a few in law practice. And so for that reason, this became an issue in 1980 during the campaign. It probably was also in 76, but particularly in 1980. By that time, women had advanced considerably over that 20-year period. And so the question was raised a lot of times, and Ronald Reagan, he didn't actually promise to appoint a woman, but he said he certainly would like to appoint a woman. And one of the reasons he had to be a little careful was he didn't have that many women who had long experience and were the kinds in that group that you would normally select justices from. And so but he was very much interested in that, and so that was definitely a consideration. And John Hybush was very helpful to me, helping me go back into the archives, and there wasn't a lot of memos prior to the appointment of Justice O'Connor, but there was at least 1 or 2 from people in the White House staff who were letting him know that this would be a very good thing to do as he was selecting. And so that's why he asked Bill Smith, William French Smith, who was the Attorney General at that time, to go, and he wanted to have a selection of people, highly qualified lawyers and judges from other benches, but he wanted to be sure that there were women among them. And so when they came to him and the list, and it was narrowed down after a lot of work done in the Department of Justice, and there were, if I remember correctly, out of a group of probably 8 or 10 in the first major cut that he made, there were, I believe, 2 women. And then ultimately, as he went through, he decided that Sandra Day O'Connor was the one he wanted, had more vetting of her. I think the things we've heard today already, what he had heard about her, the fact that she had been in the legislature, and he particularly, I think, thought it was important that a judge had legislative experience and understood what it was to be a legislator, so that they weren't making decisions just in a vacuum. And the fact that she'd had that experience in the legislature, understood what making law is, something judges are not supposed to do, but that understand how the representation of the people works into the law themselves, so that they would have an appreciation of what their job was to do in interpreting the law. So all of these things. But I think the history we heard today about her early life and the fact she worked on a ranch, I can't help but think that was a major factor of Ronald Reagan thinking very highly of her.
Evan, I guess I want to ask you to amplify that. What was the secret sauce that she brought to the selection process, and what is it that President Reagan responded to?
I spoke to Ken Starr, who was Attorney General William French Smith's special assistant running this show was Ken Starr. And he wrote a contemporaneous memo, which he gave me. And from the point of view of the Attorney General's office, yes, President Reagan in October of 1980 had said one of his first appointments would be a woman. In the Attorney General's office, they thought that was a political promise. Reagan at the time was down 10 points in Illinois with women. And they didn't really take it seriously. They thought they would get Bob Bork, or they would get a strong, somebody to push back. The Warren Court was deemed in many quarters to have gone too far. And one thing that Ronald Reagan was going to do was put justices who were going to push the pendulum back a little bit. So in the office of the Attorney General, the thought was, hey, great, we're going to get Bork or somebody like that. But the Attorney General came to them and said, no, the president says, I want a woman. Now, unless you really can't find one, we're going to have a woman. The problem was that although society was moving, the law was still very male in 1980. And so out of 600 federal judges, only 8 were women, and most of them were liberal Democrats. There was maybe one other, Cornelia Kennedy, a Court of Appeals judge, who was qualified on paper, but was not deemed to be the kind of personality that was going to relate to Ronald Reagan. And so very quickly, Judge then Arizona Court of Appeals Judge O'Connor rose to the top of the pile, even though she's a state intermediate court judge with no federal constitutional experience. She rose to the top of the pile because Bill Rehnquist was pushing for her,
Right.
because the Chief Justice of the United States, Berger, who had met her in Arizona and liked her and was promoting her career, was pushing for her through Fred Fielding. And there were other people. Goldwater gets in the act a little bit later. There were some other people. So she had a backing. And they actually, only 2 judges were interviewed, Cornelia Kennedy and Justice O'Connor. James A. Baker, the president's chief of staff, said the only really serious one was O'Connor. At the end of the interview, both Ken Starr and John Rose went down to Phoenix to your house, and 100-degree heat, they said, she made us salmon mousse. They were shaking their head. And she passed her little oral quiz with flying colors, and then, she was it. She was going to be the nominee. We can get to this. There was a little kerfluffle over her nomination, which we can talk about, but that's pretty much what happened, as far as I know, from the memo that Ken Starr wrote.
First I think I want to say something, because what you're saying dovetails so importantly with the story that Justice Ginsburg always tells, and I know she's speaking later, but she's always at great pains to talk about the men who supported and allied themselves and helped her. And I think it's just an important piece of this, when we get on our sort of girl power soapboxes about the first justices, to really understand that without having male allies, which Justice O'Connor had extraordinary friendships and relationships with men who were really willing to go to bat for her, and I think they are an unsung part of the story. But now I just want to ask Jay, as it is becoming manifest in your family that this is coming, salmon mousse notwithstanding, what was it like realizing you were just about to barrel into the biggest thing that could ever happen to anyone?
Well, it went in phases. When the seat opened up, there was, the campaign promise had been made before, and the seat opens up, and then the discussion starts happening. And it started getting in the public, some speculation started happening about who candidates would be, and both Arizona senators at the time, Barry Goldwater and Dennis DeConcini, who was a Democrat, both suggested her and said she would be a fantastic candidate. So her name was now out there as at least being a woman who might fit. And at that point, I think the family thought, the Supreme Court, there's so few seats available that come up, the odds are so long. So I think all of us, including my mom, thought, the idea, the odds of her being a serious candidate for that were really low. But then as things went on, I think there was a confluence of so many different people were independently suggesting her that she became a serious candidate. And then the interview team came out to Arizona, as Evan explained, and my dad ended up walking them out to their car to see them off, and he asked them a question and said, you know, let me ask you a question, you don't have to answer this if you don't want. How many other people are you having conversations with like this? And they said, this is the only one. And so at that point they realized, okay, this is serious. And so they shared that with the family, well, oh my goodness, this really might happen. But it's still, you think it's such a long shot. Then she was invited back, interviewed with the team at the White House over sort of a, you know, kind of a day and a half. And came back from that, and she finally got the call. And the call came into her, and she was in her chambers at state court, and it was, you know, the president got on the line with her, and she was stunned and excited and, you know, just filled with emotion. She called my dad and said, John, it's happened. So for the family, we went through thinking, no, this couldn't happen, to, oh my gosh, she has been nominated, this is so exciting. And so for us, it was just, you know, we were thrilled and intrigued, and, you know, we didn't understand that much about the, you know, my brothers and I, about the court. At this point, I was the youngest, and I just finished my freshman year in college, and I had another, my middle brother, Brian, was, I think would have been had been a junior in college, and Scott was working. So it was very exciting for us, and we were very, very supportive of her going through it, but it was a whirlwind.
General Meese, I know you came to be very good friends with both Sandra Day and John O'Connor, but can you tell us about initially meeting them and what your sort of, if you had any reservations post meeting with them, but what your first impressions were?
Well, my first impression was that I was very happy that Ronald Reagan had found the woman that he felt was appropriate to be on the court, because as we've all talked about, there weren't that many available candidates, but this was one that in any group that she might have been in, and no matter how many there were, she seemed to fit all these different qualifications. We've mentioned some of them with the legislative experience, the personality, the vetting that had gone on with these various people in the Department of Justice, all of whom came back with very laudatory recommendations. Bill Smith, who was the president put a lot of confidence in Bill on judgeships generally, and that was all done in the Department of Justice. By the time it came over to us in the White House, usually it was pretty much, we were pretty close to the end of the trail. And so I think my own feeling was that this was a very accomplished lady, a person you would like to work with or have part of your administration, even though in the august halls of the Supreme Court, where you don't have an awful lot of social contact, although I must say we probably had in the ensuing few years probably more social contact with her than any other member of the court, probably, because she was very, very active socially and was a very easy person to know. And I was extremely impressed with her, and not only with her background, but that this was great to have this person as the first woman to be on the Supreme Court.
And Evan, can you help flesh out what concerns were, to the extent that there were concerns going into confirmation hearings? What were folks worried about?
There was really only one issue, and it turned out to be minor, but for a moment it thought maybe it would, and that was that she had, as a Arizona legislator, she had voted in committee to decriminalize abortion before Roe v. Wade. And the Right to Life folks got onto this and stirred the pot in Congress. This was in 1980. The moral majority was coming on strong, and Jesse Helms was a power in Congress, and there was a concern that Thurman and Helms and John East and some others, and their staffs were saying, hey, what's this about her abortion record? And there was a moment there when they thought, whoa, you know, there were demonstrators chanting "Vote no" on O. I mean, there was a little flap, but several things happened, and maybe General Meese can speak to this. The White House was never really bothered by this. They wanted this to go away, and they sent their people up to the Hill to comment. And she was a great advocate in her own cause. I mean, she went up there and played tennis with Senator East's wife, and made friends with Strom Thurmond's wife, and charmed Jesse Helms, and she was a great representative in her own cause. the facts were squishier than had been initially suggested. Then there's one more interesting piece of this. I was very grateful that Jay gave me Justice O'Connor's diary. She kept a diary of her early years on the court. And this is her version of the meeting with Ronald Reagan. She said that when we got in there, and she was anxious about this, he said to me, you know, there's been a lot of debate about when life begins. And I think we should give the benefit of the doubt to life beginning at conception. She thinks he's warming up to a question on abortion, but he left it at that. He never asked the question. She was on the record saying that she found abortion personally abhorrent, but she had not said anything about where she was on Roe v. Wade on the abortion decision or what she would do about the courts. And she finessed that in her confirmation hearings, but when the president himself brought the subject up, he did not ask the question. She gave a little sigh of relief, didn't answer it, and they started talking about horses. Now, I think that's because the president, and maybe General Meese has a better sense of this, really didn't want to know in a way, didn't want to get into it, didn't want to have a fight over this. And truthfully, I don't think at that moment she knew exactly where she was on Roe v. Wade.
Well, she never faced the issue as a legal matter, right?
It is a
matter.
It is a hard thing, and she spent many years on the court. Later panels will talk about this, working her position. Her position became the law of the land on abortion, but it took a number of years for her to get there.
That's the question I was going to ask you, because you said when we had our preparatory call, you said the same thing. This was not an issue for the White House. They didn't want to get in a fight about this.
Well, Ronald Reagan always felt that he should not exact a promise from a judge on how they would rule on cases they hadn't seen yet.
Right.
And she felt the same way, and that was actually the way in which she got through. She had a lot of questions in the committee hearings, a lot of questions when she went around to meet the different senators, and she always took the position that I cannot tell you or make a decision on a case that I have not yet seen on the facts. And that really was true, because later on there were some abortion cases in which she ruled one way and others in which she ruled different, because the issues were slightly, or in some cases substantially different. But both she and the president had the same idea of not having a quid pro quo. In other words, making a litmus test, you might say, on any issue, particularly when you couldn't know what the facts would be in a future case. So I think it was a matter of just basic ethical feelings on both parts, that this was a subject that she wasn't going to answer a question like that.
And speaking of things that we couldn't contemplate ever happening again, she then sails through her confirmation hearing with a 99-1.
Well,
vote.
99-0 was the vote in the Senate, and I think there were maybe a couple of negative votes in the committee, but not any substantial.
I don't think so, actually. I can't remember. Senator Denton gave her a hard time. I'm not sure he.
I don't think
there were negative votes on the committee.
I don't think so. I think it was the committee.
No, there had been some. There had been some strong questioning by some.
Absolutely.
Questions.
Absolutely.
Senator Denton questioned her closely.
But it does lead me to.
Well, by the way, let me just say,
Yep.
not only was it 99-0, but the person who was absent that day sent her a book with an apology that he hadn't been there to vote for.
It was Max Baucus
would have
was
been
in Montana.
But I do think we have to talk for a minute about the confirmation hearings themselves. They're televised.
This was the first one.
Right.
This was the first time confirmation hearing had been televised. And, up until that time, they were not usually very contentious. As a matter of fact, when William O. Douglas in the 1930s was probably the most liberal justice ever recommended by Franklin Roosevelt, he sat outside the hearing room, and after he sat out there about an hour, somebody came out and said, "Mr. Douglas, you can go home. We don't have any questions." so quite a difference from today.
Different, yeah.
But there really was, they were not contentious at that time, and I suspect there were a lot of members of the Senate who didn't want to be in the position of voting against her either, because she had made such a good appearance, but also this was the first woman.
And that leads me to, and I know we're going to talk about this later as the day progresses, but this is the media event that turns her into a rock star. This is the thing that she, I think, still was the most recognized justice. I mean, everybody, stacks of mail and things sent to chambers, and she really, at the risk of, overstating it, kind of was the Kardashian of the court. She was the person who everybody knew who she was, and young girls would stand in line. And I guess I'm so ambivalent about that, because I think now we're in a moment where celebrity justices has become a thing. It wasn't something she sought out for herself, but it certainly happened. And I guess, Jay, would love for you to reflect on being in the eye of this media rock star hurricane.
Well, it was because both it was the first televised hearings and because it was the first woman. It really was an iconic moment, I think, for so many women and professional women. And throughout the rest of her life, so many women would come up to her and tell stories similar to yours about remembering exactly where they were when they learned that she was the first woman to be appointed to the court. And it was a real game changer. And I think, she really did become a well-known figure. At that time, most Americans couldn't name one other justice on the court. That was just, they were not, people in DC who paid attention to these things, and lawyers would know differently. But if you asked a common person, name somebody name how many people you count on the Supreme Court, most people could name zero. And so her name actually was, then when you asked the question, she'd been in the court, they could name her, those that could name some of the justices. So she was well recognized around D.C. and going around town. And I think for her, I think she felt an extra burden as the first woman and as a recognized figure, about how she would perform in the court. And she said many times, it's a good thing to be the first on the court, but you don't want to be the last. Right. So she knew that all eyes would be on her, and she had to do her very best to perform well.
And Evan, go ahead.
Well, it's just to follow up on that, in her diary, she knew everybody was watching. And in her first oral argument, all eyes are on her, because they're waiting for that first question. And she starts to ask the first question, and the idiot lawyer arguing in front of her talks over her.
Oh.
She wrote in her diary, "I felt put down." That's a very unusual emotion for her, and it didn't last very long. But think about this for a second. She had been a state legislator, a state court judge. She had not dealt with the U.S. Constitution, and she had to learn it that summer. She really did. She had to learn all of Supreme Court jurisprudence and the U.S. Constitution that summer. She lost 10 pounds. I mean, and the person preparing her was a young Justice Department aide named John Roberts, the current Chief Justice. And we laughed about this a little bit because she was not satisfied with his pace. She couldn't get it. He couldn't get the stuff. He literally couldn't get it Xerox fast enough to get to her. And she was a little impatient about it. But she had, think of that for a homework assignment. And she knew that they were going to be watching her at the Supreme Court. And they're going to pick this up in the next panel, I'm sure. But those early days on the court were not easy. It's a cold place. It's marble. She would go out into those courtyards, interior courtyards, and turn her face up to the sun because she missed the Arizona sun. Her first lunch at the court, only 4 other justices showed up. The Brethren remember the Brethren, the Woodward and Armstrong book had just come out. The justices were suspicious of each other. Who was the leaker? And it was not that easy for her. There was no sort of roadmap to how to do this. Justice Powell was very gracious and got her a secretary, and she was very grateful for that. Justice Rehnquist, her pal, was oddly standoffish in these early years. That was not true later. Justice Rehnquist had a terrible back condition, and I think that was a factor for him. But she was a little lonely, and she knew, as Jay said, it's good to be first, but you don't want to be last. And she knew they were watching her. She did very well. I know from a letter that Justice Powell wrote his family 1 month in, he said, "She's brilliant." So she made her mark right away. But it's an intimidating thing to walk into that setting. One other story about this. They have a wonderful tradition at the Supreme Court of shaking hands before they go into conference. Every justice shakes hands of every other justice. Justice Byron White, Whizzer White, the great all-pro halfback from the Detroit Lions, I think it was, shook her hand so hard he crushed it. So the first woman went into her first conference crying. She said there were tears, this is her word, squirting out of her eyes because he had crushed her hand. You know, and the other justices were, Justice Stevens told us, you know, there's a tradition, the junior justice takes notes and gets coffee. Justice Stevens said they talk about this. I said, well, we're going to ask her to get coffee, but they didn't.
So this brings me to the kind of mystery that animates my thinking about Justice O'Connor, and I'm going to ask each of you to try to respond to it. We've talked so much about how we think about her being the first, and I'm always more curious about how she thought about being the first. And I say it in part because I know she spent her whole career saying it didn't matter, right? A wise old man and a wise old woman would come to the same conclusion. There is no such thing as female jurisprudence. We're the same. She was very, very meticulous about saying that her gender didn't matter, except for her that it mattered. And I always am mindful of that because when John Roberts was tagged to replace her, she famously said, he's a very good and excellent choice. Apparently he was now fast enough to pass the Xerox test.
He took an Evelyn Wood course.
Exactly, on efficiency. Yes. But when he was tapped, her comment, her very first reflexive, I think she was fly fishing at the time, and her first reflexive comment was, he's a very good choice, but it should have been a woman. And I guess that to me encapsulates this ambivalence, that it mattered terribly to her that she was the first woman and that there were women on the court, but she also really wanted to make the claim that it didn't matter. And so I'm asking you an Escher staircase question, but I wonder, and maybe we can start with you, Jay, what did it mean to her?
I think she felt that both those statements were true. So from a legal principle, I think she did feel that it is sexist to say that a woman is going to vote differently than a man on a legal issue. So I think she felt strongly, and that was sort of what she would sort of always say, but I think that she felt that it mattered societally, and she thought that it helped the court to have a variety of perspectives. And so I think she really believed both of those things at the same time. And it seemingly seemed to conflict with one another, but I think they were both true for her.
Evan?
She was an unfeminist feminist. I mean,
right.
she certainly advanced the cause of women's rights as much as anybody ever, but she never explicitly referred to herself as a feminist. She saw, I mean, Jay said that I framed the book as her as a bridge. That was her frame. She had a poem about a pilgrim who built a bridge.
She would use it in her speeches, right?
Yeah, in her speeches, a pilgrim who builds a bridge so that others may cross. And then the pilgrim doesn't cross himself. It's so others may cross. And I think that she saw herself in that transitional role. And who better? I mean, who better than Sandra Day? How lucky we were that she was the first.
And I think, General Meese, I would ask it slightly different, but the same question, which is, I remember her always telling the story of how Justice Scalia would tweak her about, you know, you only got this gig because President Reagan made a, we're not going to say promise, but whatever he, you know, a pledge or right. said it, and that having heard that that's kind of why she got the job. She was nobody's Bork. She was taken on as a woman, and yet she always said it didn't bother her at all. When Scalia would tease her about it, she would just laugh it off.
Well, actually, as you know, Nino Scalia was quite a humorist. I mean, his tweaking was not by trying to put her down or mean in any way. It was kind of a jovial type of thing that he had with the other members of the court, but particularly her. But I don't think, I think she had spent her entire life doing things that were mostly jobs held by men. So this was not particularly unusual in that sense. But she also was, as everybody has said, she was no longer she was not a woman. She didn't give up being a woman, and yet she was able to carry this out in excellent fashion. And to me, it was even more than being the first woman on the court. I think one thing that she did, she put a human face on the court. Up until that, I don't think anybody thought of justices as human beings. And this was something that I think she added to it just because of the personality that she had, as well as the way in which she treated other people. And I think that was a real plus, not only for the court, but for women in general and for the country.
I think that's you're going to hear a lot about chili and cherry blossoms and all the ways that she really did, I think, become kind of the cruise director on the Supreme Court, just really mindful of how to treat people with this capacious, big heart and infinite patience. I want to thank Evan Thomas, whose book, First, Sandra Day O'Connor, is really an extraordinary piece of work. I want to thank Jay O'Connor, Managing Principal, Silvertree Associates, and I want to thank General Edwin Meese III, Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation, 75th Attorney General of the United States. On behalf of all of us, it has been just a joy and a pleasure starting your day hearing about the truly extraordinary Sandra Day O'Connor. Thank you.
Thank you.